The Galactic Council demanded Earth's surrender. Humanity chose defiance. The signal did not knock. It did not wait for permission. It cut through every television, every radio, every phone, every digital billboard on Earth at exactly 3 p.m, Greenwich time, and it spoke in every human language at once. I was sitting in the middle of a security briefing in the United Nations building in Geneva when every screen in the room changed without warning. General Claire Dobbs dropped her coffee. Colonel Peter Hale grabbed his sidearm before realizing there was nothing to shoot. I just sat still and listened, because something in my chest already understood that this moment had a weight to it that no amount of moving around would fix. The voice was calm. It was not the calm of something gentle. It was the calm of something enormous, something that had never once had a reason to be afraid of anything it was speaking to. It introduced itself as the representative voice of the Galactic Council, a governing body composed of 23 intelligent species, managing over 400 star systems, operating under what it called the Covenant of Sentient Order. Then it told us what we were. Tier 0. That was the classification. Tier 0 species, it explained, were those considered too developmentally unstable to be permitted autonomous governance. Species in this category had historically demonstrated patterns of self-directed violence, ecological destruction, and political fragmentation that posed a statistical risk to surrounding space when such species achieved faster-than-light travel. It said this in the same tone a doctor might use to explain a diagnosis to a patient who had no say in the treatment. And then it gave us 72 hours. 72 hours to disarm our military structures. 72 hours to dissolve our national governments. 72 hours to accept custodial oversight from the Council, which would, in its own words, guide humanity through a managed developmental period of no less than 300 years. 300 years. I remember that number landing in the room like something physical. General Dobbs went pale. Colonel Hale put down his sidearm and sat down slowly, like his knees had stopped working. The other 12 people in the room stared at the screen in absolute silence. The broadcast lasted 9 minutes and 40 seconds. When it ended, every screen in the room went back to what it had been showing before, as if nothing had happened. The coffee General Dobbs had dropped was still spreading across the floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. My name is Yara Osei. I am a commander in the United Nations Defense Liaison Division, which is a title that sounds more important than it usually is. My job, most days, is to translate between soldiers and diplomats, to sit in rooms where neither side fully trusts the other and help them understand each other well enough to avoid making things worse. I am not a hero. I am not a general. I am someone who is very good at staying calm when everyone around her is not. I stayed calm for approximately 4 minutes after the broadcast ended. Then I walked to the window and looked out at the lake and said, very quietly, no. Nobody heard me. I was not speaking to anyone in the room. I was speaking to whatever was out there beyond the sky, to the voice that had just told 8 billion people what they were allowed to be and for how long. The next 6 hours were the most chaotic of my professional life. The Unsecurity Council convened an emergency session within the hour. I sat in the back of the chamber and watched representatives from every major nation speak, and what struck me was not the anger, though there was plenty of it. What struck me was the fear underneath the anger. Not fear of the Council, exactly. Fear of being wrong. Fear of choosing resistance and discovering it was impossible. Fear of choosing surrender and discovering it was unforgivable. The Secretary General, a tall steady woman named Helen Ward, sat at the head of the chamber and listened to everyone. She did not interrupt. She did not show what she was thinking. She had been in politics for 30 years and she had the face of someone who had learned long ago that the first thing a room full of frightened people needed was one person who appeared not to be. The argument split almost immediately into 2 positions. The first position was pragmatic. We do not know what these beings are capable of. We do not know their weapons, their numbers, their technology. To resist without knowing these things is not courage, it is carelessness. Accept the terms, negotiate from within, and work toward reclassification through compliance. This position was held, loudly and persistently, by several representatives whose nations had the most to lose in any physical conflict. The second position was simpler and harder to argue against. We cannot accept. Not because we are certain we can win, but because some things, once surrendered, do not come back. Sovereignty is one of them. If we hand it over today because we are afraid, we will spend 300 years trying to remember who we were before we were afraid, and we may never find it. I did not speak in the chamber. It was not my place. But when the session broke for a recess and I found Helen Ward standing alone in a side corridor, looking out a window exactly the way I had been looking out mine 2 hours earlier, I walked over and stood beside her. She spoke first. "You have something to say." "I said it already," I told her. To myself, after the broadcast. "But I'll say it again." She looked at me. "No," I said. She was quiet for a long moment. The corridor was empty. Outside, the late afternoon light was turning the lake gold. "What does no look like," she said, "when the other side has ships that cross the distance between stars?" It was a fair question. It was the only question that mattered. And I did not have a complete answer yet, but I had the beginning of one, because I had been thinking about it since the moment the broadcast ended and I had noticed something that nobody else in the chamber seemed to have caught. The council's representative had called us predictable. It had said it in passing, almost as a footnote in its list of our failures. Tier 0 species exhibit predictable escalation patterns. Predictable threat responses. Predictable capitulation timelines. It had said this as a criticism, as evidence of our primitive nature, and it was possible that was exactly what it meant. But I had spent my entire career in rooms full of people who underestimated what they were dealing with. And I knew what it looked like when an assumption was about to become someone's biggest mistake. "No," I said again, this time answering her question properly, "does not look like what they expect it to look like. That's the only way it works." Helen Ward looked at me for a long time. Then she nodded once. It was not agreement, not yet. It was permission. Permission to keep talking. Permission to figure out what the beginning of an answer looked like. The clock on my phone read 68 hours and 42 minutes remaining when we walked back into the chamber. Outside, across every city on Earth, people were watching the same skies they had always watched. The same stars. But the stars were different now. They had something in them. Something watching back. And somewhere above the Pacific Ocean, almost invisible against the dark, 3 council observation vessels held their position and waited for humanity's response. They had calculated 72 hours. They had not calculated what humans do when they are told what they are not allowed to be. Helen Ward sat back down at the head of the chamber. She folded her hands on the table. And for the first time since the broadcast, she spoke. "We are not going to surrender," she said. "So let's talk about what we are going to do instead." The room exploded. And somewhere in that explosion, something changed. Something shifted from fear into something harder, something that had no name in the Council's taxonomy of human behavior, something that they had never thought to model because they had never seen it in a species that had every rational reason to simply give up. 67 hours and 59 minutes. We got to work. The floor of the emergency bunker beneath the uncomplex was not designed for the number of people currently standing on it. I counted 43 in the first hour. By hour 6, it was over 100. They came from everywhere. Scientists pulled from research stations, generals flown in from every continent, engineers, linguists, astrophysicists, 2 people who had spent their careers studying the acoustic patterns of deep space signals, and 1 retired Navy admiral named George Cross who, when asked why he had been included, said simply, "Because I've been waiting for this my whole life." I liked George Cross immediately. The bunker had been built during a different era of human fear, when the threats we imagined came from each other. It had thick walls and poor ventilation and a coffee machine that had not worked properly since the previous decade, and it became, in the space of about 4 hours, the most important room on Earth. Helen Ward stood at the front and set the terms clearly and quickly. There would be no debate about whether to resist. That decision was made. The only question on the table was how. She gave everyone 60 seconds to object to that framing. Nobody objected. Then she pointed at a physicist named Dr. Emre Kaya, who had flown in from Ankara, and said, "You start." Dr. Emre Kaya was not what I expected. He was shorter than me, wore a jacket that was slightly too large for him, and had the specific kind of energy that people get when they have been thinking very hard about something for a very long time and have finally been given permission to say it out loud. He walked to the front of the room, connected his laptop to the projector, and pulled up a single slide. It had no charts or data on it. It had one sentence. They have never fought anyone like us. He gave the room a moment to read it. Then he started talking. The Council's military history, he explained, was extensive. Over 4,000 years of recorded engagements. Wars of expansion, enforcement actions, the suppression of 3 species before their reclassification, border conflicts between member states. And in all of that history, every single conflict had one thing in common. Both sides were fighting the same kind of war. Fleet against fleet. Standing military against standing military. Structured force against structured force. Humanity had never fought that kind of war. Not really. Or rather, we had, but we had also spent the last 5,000 years developing something else entirely alongside it. Something unplanned, improvised, personal. Something we did when the other side was bigger and better armed and we had no logical reason to believe we could win. He called it the WASP strategy. Not because wasps were powerful. Because a wasp does not need to be powerful. A wasp needs only to be willing, to be fast, to be everywhere at once, and to make the experience of fighting it so persistently unpleasant that whatever is swatting at it eventually decides the effort is not worth the outcome. Humanity, Dr. Kaya said, had been developing WASP strategies since before we had writing. Every time a larger force had tried to crush a smaller one on this planet, the smaller one had found a way to make the cost of crushing it higher than the reward. Not always successfully. But the pattern was there, repeated across centuries and cultures, refined and passed down and built upon. And the Council, according to the signal intercepts that had been quietly decoded in the 12 hours since the broadcast, had absolutely no strategic framework for it. Their battle models assumed symmetric engagements. Defined targets. Identifiable command structures. A clear moment of capitulation. They had never tried to stop something that had no center. The room was very quiet while Dr. Kaya talked. Not the quiet of people who were bored or unconvinced. The quiet of people who were doing very fast math in their heads. Colonel Peter Hale, who had been skeptical of everything since the moment he had reached for his sidearm and found nothing useful to point it at, raised his hand. Our conventional military assets are not capable of standing against their fleet. We've run the numbers. Even combined, we lose in any direct engagement. Dr. Kaya nodded. Yes. So we don't have a direct engagement. Then what do we have? Everything else. That was when the room shifted. I felt it, the way you feel a temperature change, something physical passing through the air. Because everyone in that room had spent the last several hours thinking about what they did not have, counting up their deficits, measuring the gap between humanity's capability and the Council's. And Dr. Kaya had just reoriented the entire question. Not what do we have against their fleet? What do we have that their fleet does not know how to deal with? The answer, it turned out, was considerable. Earth had several thousand mining and cargo vessels operating in near-Earth orbit and the asteroid belt. Most of them were not weapons. But most things are not weapons until someone needs them to be. The Council's targeting systems, from what we could infer from their observation vessels' skin patterns, were calibrated to recognize military ship signatures. Cargo haulers read as non-combatants. They were, in the Council's threat model, invisible. Earth had 17 high-powered industrial laser arrays, used for asteroid processing. They had never been aimed at anything other than rock. Earth had, spread across 16 nations, approximately 4,000 orbital debris management systems. Small, fast, remotely operated, designed to intercept and redirect space junk before it could damage satellites. Individually, each one was trivial. Collectively, directed by the right software, they could create an engagement environment that no fleet admiral trained on conventional warfare had ever had to plan for. And Earth had something else. Something that could not be built in 72 hours because it had been building for thousands of years. It was the thing that General George Cross had been talking about for the last 2 hours in the corner of the room, speaking quietly to a group of military historians and strategic planners, drawing on a notepad with a pen because he claimed he thought better that way. People. Not soldiers. Not assets. People. 8 billion individuals who had woken up that morning to find out that something out in the galaxy had decided to tell them who they were and what they were worth, and who had collectively, in cities and villages and apartments and farms across every continent, decided that this was not acceptable. I had been monitoring the global news feeds throughout the session. I had seen the protests forming within hours of the broadcast, and I want to be clear about what kind of protests they were. They were not panicked. They were not chaotic. They were people standing in streets holding signs, and the signs did not say things like "Please do not hurt us" or "We surrender." The signs said things like "We are still here and not yours," and, in one image from a city in West Africa that I will remember for the rest of my life, a handwritten sign held by a girl who could not have been more than 12 years old that said simply, "We have not given you permission." In Lagos, a retired mechanical engineer had already started broadcasting online tutorials on how to convert commercial drones for electromagnetic shielding. In Mumbai, 3 robotics students had pulled an all-nighter and built a working prototype of an automated countermeasure system using parts from a consumer electronics warehouse. In a small town in Iceland, a former military technician had driven to a storage facility at 2 in the morning and begun checking the condition of equipment that had been mothballed 20 years ago. Nobody had told these people to do any of this. Nobody had organized them. They had simply decided that their hands should be doing something, and they had started. Dr. Kaya called this distributed initiative. George Cross called it the most dangerous thing any military in history had ever tried to plan around. Helen Ward called it, quietly, in a moment when she thought no one was listening, the thing about us that I have always been most proud of. I called the Secretary General's assistant and got her a fresh cup of coffee, because it was 3 in the morning and she had not stopped working since noon and someone needed to. At the 50-hour mark, we had a plan. It was not elegant. Elegance, George Cross said, was for species that had enough time and resources to afford it. What we had was something better. We had something honest. The plan was distributed, layered, and deliberately difficult to eliminate in any single strike. It was built on the assumption that we would take losses. It did not try to win by defeating the Council's fleet. It tried to win by making the Council's fleet understand that completing its mission would cost more than the Council had calculated. There was a cost to this. We all knew it. George Cross stated it plainly, the way he stated everything, without flinching and without softening it. Some of the people who execute this plan will not come back. Nobody argued. Nobody pretended that was not true. And nobody said they would not do it. At hour 68, with 4 hours remaining on the Council's deadline, I sat down at a secured communications terminal and drafted the response. Helen Ward reviewed it. George Cross reviewed it. Dr. Kaya reviewed it. Then I sent it to every member nation for final sign-off, and every single one of them, including the 3 that had argued loudest for compliance in the first session, signed it. It was 3 words. We respectfully decline. I pressed send with 6 minutes to spare on the deadline clock. Then I sat back and looked at the ceiling of the bunker and let myself, just for a moment, acknowledge how frightened I was. Not of what we had decided. I was certain about what we had decided. I was frightened of what came next, of the space between the decision and the outcome, of all the things that could go wrong in that space. George Cross sat down next to me. He had been awake for 36 hours and he looked it, but his eyes were clear and calm. "You holding up?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Because I was." "Are you?" He almost smiled. "I told you. I've been waiting for this my whole life." The response from the Council came in exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds for a signal to travel from their ships to our terminals, which meant they were not far. They were very close. They had been close the entire time. The alien representative's voice came through the terminal, and for the first time, something in that voice was different. Still calm, still enormous, but there was a quality underneath it now that had not been there before. A precision, a sharpening, like something recalibrating. "Enforcement will begin at dawn, orbital time." The screen went dark. I looked at Dr. Kaya across the room. He was already on his feet, already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead. He caught my eye and gave me a small nod. Then George Cross stood up beside me, and I heard him say, quietly and with great satisfaction, "Good." They came to the ocean. I did not understand what he meant yet. I would, in about 9 hours. I would understand it completely. The clock on the wall showed 3 hours and 41 minutes to orbital dawn. We were not ready. We would never be ready in the way the Council expected readiness to look. But we were something else instead. We were awake. All 8 billion of us. Awake and watching the sky and waiting, and in that waiting, doing the thing that the Council had studied and charted and classified and had somehow still not understood. The thing about a WASP is this. It does not ask whether it is capable of winning. It does not consult probability models or tactical assessments. It sees something threatening what it protects, and it moves. Pure, immediate, total. Somewhere above the Pacific Ocean, the Council's enforcement fleet began its approach. Below, a cargo hauler pilot named Dan Cole was already on his third cup of tea and running pre-flight checks on equipment that had no business being in a conflict but was about to be there anyway. Below that, in the dark water, an old naval research vessel had turned on instruments that had not been active in 15 years. And below that, spread across an entire planet that had been given 72 hours to decide who it was, 8 billion people had already decided. Orbital dawn was coming. We were not what the Council had modeled. We were something they had no category for. And they were about to find out. The first Council ship broke through the cloud layer at 6:14 in the morning, Pacific time, and I was watching it on a satellite feed from a relay station in northern Canada that we had repurposed as a forward observation post. It was beautiful. I want to say that plainly, because it was true and because pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The ship was vast and silver-white and perfectly smooth, shaped like something between a blade and a wing, and it moved through the upper atmosphere with a silence that made its size feel almost unreal. Behind it, 3 more ships were following, holding a precise formation that I could already tell was designed for a specific kind of engagement. A symmetrical engagement. A clean engagement. A battlefield with defined edges and identifiable opponents. I was coordinating from inside a converted weather monitoring station on a mountainside in British Columbia, chosen because it had excellent line-of-sight communication with 12 of our orbital relay assets and because it was, from the outside, completely unremarkable. The kind of building that does not appear on military target lists because it does not look like it belongs on a military target list. There were 9 of us in the room. 2 communication specialists, 3 tactical coordinators, George Cross, Dr. Kaya on a secure link from a different location because we had agreed it was unwise to put everyone in one place, and 2 people whose entire job was to monitor the Council's scanning patterns and report any indication that our position had been identified. The 9th person was a young analyst named Oliver Webb who had transferred to the Undefense Division 14 months ago from a satellite imaging company, and who had not slept in 30 hours but whose eyes were completely focused and whose hands were completely steady. I had learned to trust steady hands over the previous 72 hours. They were the best indicator I had found of whether someone was actually functional or just performing functionality. Oliver was the one who caught it first. "They're scanning in geometric patterns," he said, without looking up from his screen. "Standard grid search. They're looking for military installations." "Are they finding any?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "All of the ones we left obvious." That had been George Cross's idea. We had kept every major conventional military installation fully active and visible, all radar signatures running, all normal communication traffic in place, everything exactly where it should be according to the profile of a planet organizing a conventional defense. The Council's scanners would find it all, and they would build a targeting map around it, and that targeting map would be accurate and complete and tell them almost nothing useful. Because the things that were actually going to matter in the next several hours were not at any of those locations. The first engagement began 14 minutes into the fleet's atmospheric entry. And it did not begin where anyone on either side expected. Dan Cole, piloting a modified cargo hauler out of a private launch facility in Western Australia, had been holding position at an altitude that the Council's tactical models classified as civilian transit range. His ship's signature read as a standard commercial hauler, which it was, except that the cargo bay had been fitted with a pair of industrial laser arrays borrowed from an asteroid processing facility in the belt, and the navigation system had been upgraded by 3 engineers who had worked through 2 consecutive nights on a plan that, as Dan told me later, he had not entirely believed would function until the moment it did. He came in below and behind the rearmost Council ship, outside the coverage arc of its defensive systems, and he fired a 2-second burst from both arrays at the ship's aft sensor cluster. He did not destroy the ship. He did not even seriously damage it. What he did was create an 18-second window of partial sensor blindness in that ship's rearward hemisphere, and in those 18 seconds, 4 automated orbital debris interceptors, reprogrammed and remotely piloted, flew into that blind spot and attached themselves to the ship's outer hull, where they sat completely undetected. Den was already moving before the 18 seconds were up, dropping altitude and changing his transponder code and disappearing into commercial traffic, indistinguishable from 100 other cargo runs happening across the planet that morning. The Council's ship never identified the attacker. 6 minutes later, something similar happened to the lead ship, from a different direction, using completely different equipment operated by completely different people who had never spoken to Dan Cole and did not know what he had done. Then a third incident, targeting the ship on the eastern flank. Then a fourth. Each one was small. Each one was, by the Council's tactical standards, trivial. A scratch on a vessel that could withstand pressures that would flatten a human city. No casualties, no significant damage, nothing that would show up as a meaningful threat in their engagement assessments. But here is what was happening in the Council fleet's command structure while those 4 small incidents were occurring. 4 incidents in 6 minutes, from 4 different directions, using 4 different methods, with no identifiable source for any of them. Their targeting systems were generating threat assessments and finding no targets to assign them to. Their tactical models were looking for a pattern and not finding one. Their commanders were waiting for the engagement to clarify, for the picture to resolve into something they recognized, and it was not resolving. I was watching the fleet's position data on our tracking system when George Cross leaned over my shoulder and pointed at the screen. "Look at that," he said. The lead ship had adjusted its altitude. Just slightly, just enough to widen its sensor range below. It was reacting. It was trying to find the source of the contacts. It was doing exactly what a rational tactical mind would do when faced with ambiguous threat data, which was to increase its information-gathering posture. George Cross was smiling. "They're looking," he said. "They can't help it. When something hits you and you can't see where from, you look. You have to look. It's basic. It's hardwired." "And while they're looking down," I said, understanding. "They're not looking at what's coming from the sides," he said. "Or the sides of the sides. There's no end to the sides with this approach. That's the whole point." The orbital debris interceptors that had attached to the first ship's hull were not weapons. They were sensors. Tiny, cheap, enormously useful sensors that were now feeding us real-time hull temperature and energy output data from the inside of a Council warship, data we had no other way of obtaining, data that in the next several hours would tell Dr. Kaya things about their propulsion and weapon systems that would have taken years to figure out through observation alone. I thought about the Council's representative calling us predictable and felt something warm and specific in my chest. By hour 3, there had been 27 separate incidents across the fleet. None of them coordinated in the traditional sense. Nobody was directing Dan Cole or the debris interceptor teams or the 17 other groups that had found their own ways to participate in ways we had not even planned. They had seen the framework, understood the approach, and added themselves to it independently, the way living things do when they are given a direction and trusted to move in it. The Council had not anticipated any of this. I knew this because their communication traffic, which we were monitoring on decrypted frequencies that, again, they had never bothered to encrypt because why would they, was showing something I had never expected to see in the communications of a 4,000-year-old galactic authority. Confusion. Genuine, operational confusion. Their commanders were issuing orders that contradicted each other. Their tactical assessments were being revised every few minutes as new data came in that did not fit the models. Their scanning operations kept finding things that looked like threats and then reclassifying them as civilian traffic, and then finding them again somewhere else and reclassifying them again. Colonel Peter Hale, who was coordinating from a completely separate location, sent me a short message at hour 4. It said, "They don't know where to look." I sent back, "Good. Make sure it stays that way." At hour 5, something happened that none of us had planned for, because it was not something that could be planned for. It was something that happened because of who we are. A civilian communications satellite, operated by a private company in Singapore, began broadcasting on a frequency that the Council's ships were using for internal coordination. The broadcast was not strategic intelligence or tactical data. It was a recording. A piece of music, specifically a choral piece that had been written during an older period of human conflict, music that had been composed by people who were afraid and who had put that fear and that determination into sound because sometimes that is the only place there is to put such things. It broadcast for 4 minutes and 17 seconds before the company's ground team realized what had happened and shut it down. We never found out who had redirected the satellite, or whether it was deliberate or an accident. But for 4 minutes and 17 seconds, every council ship above the Pacific received a transmission they had no category for. Not a weapon. Not a communication. Not a tactical signal. A human voice, or rather many human voices together, making a sound that had no strategic value and no military purpose, and which was, by any rational measure, the least relevant thing that could possibly be occurring in the middle of an enforcement action. I watched the council's communication traffic during those 4 minutes and 17 seconds. It went silent. Not the silence of jamming or interference. The silence of people listening to something they did not understand and could not stop listening to. That silence lasted 7 seconds after the broadcast ended. Then their communications resumed. George Cross was sitting beside me when it happened. When the music started, he went very still. When it ended, he sat quietly for a moment, then he said, "They've never heard anything like that." "No," I said. "They don't have a response for it." "No." "Good," he said softly. "Let them sit with that." At hour 7, the fleet had still not advanced. They had not retreated. They had not issued any new communications to Earth's surface. They had stabilized at altitude and were running what looked like extensive scanning operations, trying to build a complete picture of what they were dealing with before making another move. It was the pause we needed. It was the pause George Cross had said would come, if we made the cost of moving feel uncertain enough. Not impossible. Not prohibitive. Uncertain. Which, for a force that had operated on certainty for 4,000 years, was apparently quite a significant thing. The message from Dr. Kaya came through at hour 7 and 22 minutes. It was short. Hull sensor data confirms they are running on a single primary propulsion variant with 2 known resonance frequencies. We have 6 industrial microwave arrays that can be tuned to those frequencies. I need 8 hours and authorization. I forwarded it to George Cross. He read it and looked at me. 8 hours, he said. If we can hold the pause that long, I said. Can we? I thought about Dan Cole, somewhere over the Southern Ocean, preparing for a second run. I thought about the debris interceptor teams, already reprogramming their next wave. I thought about the 12-year-old girl in West Africa with her handwritten sign, and about all the people like her who were not in this room but were part of this anyway. Yes, I said. George Cross nodded. Then we hold it, he said. We held it. Hour 8 came and went. The fleet remained stationary. Every time it showed signs of resuming its advance, something new would happen below it, another small irritation, another ambiguous contact, another thing that did not fit its models, and the advance would pause again while the tactical computers recalculated. It was not glorious. It was not the way stories usually describe resistance. There were no dramatic confrontations, no single defining moment of heroism. It was patience and persistence and 100 people doing small things well and trusting that the small things would add up to something the large things could not easily undo. Colonel Hale sent another message at hour 9. 3 of their ships have reduced altitude. I think they're getting frustrated. Frustration. In a 4,000-year-old fleet. Directed at us. I wrote back, good. And then, at hour 9 and 44 minutes, the fleet's communication traffic changed. The pattern of their internal messages shifted from tactical coordination to something else. Something that took our linguistics team 20 minutes to fully parse, because it was not a language pattern they had seen from the council before. When the translation came through, I read it twice. The fleet commander was requesting new strategic guidance from the council's central authority. They were asking what to do. George Cross read the translation over my shoulder. Then he sat down and said nothing for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. Do you understand what that means? They didn't have a plan for this, I said. They had a plan, he said. They just had to abandon it. And now they're waiting for new orders. And while they wait, nothing advances, he paused. We bought time. How much? Enough for Emre, he said. And maybe enough for something else. I did not know what the something else was yet. I would learn it in the next part of this story, in a communication that reached me through channels I did not know existed, from a source I had not expected, from somewhere far beyond the sky above the Pacific. But in that moment, in hour 9 and 44 minutes of the first day of humanity's defiance, what I knew was this. The Council fleet had come to Earth expecting an ending. A quick, orderly resolution to a predictable situation. They had come with all the certainty of something that had never been wrong before. And they had been answered by everything we were. Not a perfect answer. Not a safe answer. An honest one. George Cross stood up from his chair and stretched and said, "Anyone else want terrible coffee?" And I said yes, because it was 9 in the morning and I had been awake for 41 hours, and some things are worth appreciating even in the middle of everything. The fleet was waiting for orders. We were not. There is a particular quality to silence when it comes from something vast. It is not peaceful. It presses. I had been awake for 47 hours when the contact reached me, and I want to be precise about that because it matters for what I am about to describe. When you have been awake that long, when your body has been running on urgency and cold coffee and the specific kind of focus that comes from knowing that everything depends on staying sharp, you become very good at distinguishing between things that are real and things your exhausted mind is generating to fill the gaps. What I received at 47 hours was real. It came through a signal path that should not have existed. Our deep space relay buoys, which we had placed in near-Earth orbit over the previous decade to extend communication range for asteroid belt operations, had been quietly receiving traffic that was not addressed to us. Encrypted traffic, piggybacked onto frequencies we had never thought to monitor because there was no reason to monitor them, riding in the background of space itself like something written in invisible ink. It was Oliver Webb who found it. Oliver, who had been running continuous signal analysis on every frequency our systems could reach, who had not slept properly in days but who sat at his station with that steady hands focus I had come to rely on. He flagged it to me at hour 46 as something anomalous. I took one look at the signal pattern and called Dr. Kaya. Kaya had the decryption running within an hour. What it produced was not a block of data or a tactical transmission. It was a voice. The voice identified itself as Sail. An envoy of the Rin Collective, which was, according to the Council's own classification system, a Tier 1 species. Monitored. Permitted autonomous governance, but under continuous oversight. Watched, in other words. Managed. Controlled in the way that the Council described as developmental support and the Rin apparently experienced differently. I answered the contact on a secured frequency, alone in a side room of the weather station with George Cross standing outside the door because he trusted me but also believed in covering every exit as a matter of principle. Sail's voice was not what I expected. I had built up, in my mind, a picture of alien communication as something formal, structured, built on information transfer rather than connection. Sail did not sound like that. Sail sounded like someone who had been thinking about this conversation for a long time and had been waiting, with great patience and some tension, for the right moment to have it. "Commander Osei," the voice said, in English that was almost perfectly accented but with a cadence that was not quite human, a rhythm that followed slightly different rules. "I have been authorized to make contact by a coalition within the Rin Collective who have been watching Earth since your broadcast." "Watching us resist, you mean," I said. "Watching you choose," Sail said. "It is not the same thing. Resistance is a reaction. Choice is something else." I sat with that for a moment. "What do you want, Sail?" "To give you something. And to ask for something in return." A pause. "But first, I think you should understand what is actually happening in this situation. Not the surface of it. The part underneath." What Sail told me in the next 40 minutes rearranged my understanding of everything. The Council's ultimatum to Earth had not been triggered by our development rate exceeding some administrative threshold. It had been triggered by something that had been noticed 3 years earlier by a Council research team conducting routine analysis of humanity's technological acceleration curve. Something that, when they ran the projections forward using the Council's standard developmental models, produced a result that had been immediately classified and buried in a report that only the ALUN's senior governance body was permitted to read. At our current rate, accounting for the nonlinear acceleration patterns that characterize certain types of species development, Earth was projected to achieve faster-than-light capability not in the 1,000 years the Council had estimated, but in approximately 90 years. 90 years. In galactic terms, that was not a developmental milestone. That was an emergency. Because a species that reached faster than light travel before being properly integrated into the Council's governance structure was, by historical precedent, extraordinarily difficult to manage afterward. We had not been classified as Tier 0 because we were too violent or too unstable. We had been classified as Tier 0 because we were too fast. We were accelerating in ways the Council's models could not account for, and the models had suggested one explanation. Contact. Not current contact. Ancient contact. There was evidence, buried in statistical analyses of human neurological and cultural development patterns, of an interaction event approximately 40,000 years ago. Something that had touched our species at a foundational level and introduced patterns of recursive problem-solving, adaptive innovation, and collaborative knowledge building that were not typical of natural Tier 0 development. Someone had been here before. Someone had left something behind. And whatever they had left behind had been working in us, quietly, for 40,000 years, and was why we were not where the Council expected us to be. Who? I asked. We don't know, Sale said. The alien don't know either. That is part of what frightens them. They are not only managing an unexpectedly fast species. They are dealing with evidence of an unknown actor who was capable of reaching a pre-technological species and modifying its developmental trajectory without detection. That is a capability that exceeds anything the Council currently possesses. I thought about that for a long moment. So we're not just a problem, I said. We're a question. Yes, Sale said. And the alien do not like questions they cannot answer. The decision to issue the ultimatum was, at its core, not strategic. It was fear. Fear. The 4,000-year-old Galactic Authority that had told us we were too primitive to govern ourselves had sent its fleet to our planet because it was afraid. Not of our weapons. Of our potential. Of what we might become. Of the question mark we represented in a galaxy they believed they had fully mapped. I told George Cross when he came back in with coffee. He stood very still while I talked. Then he sat down slowly and said, "So we're not the dangerous ones." "Not in the way they described," I said. "We're dangerous in a completely different way. The kind of dangerous that's harder to eliminate," I said. "Because it's not about weapons or armies. It's about what we might figure out. What we might become." George Cross held his coffee with both hands and was quiet for a moment. "And the Rin Collective? What do they want?" "To tell us," I said. "And to help. Because watching this happen to us is, for them, personal." The Rin Collective had been Tier 1 for 300 years. They had been told that Tier 1 was progress, advancement, recognition of their development. What it actually was, Sale explained without bitterness but with great clarity, was a more comfortable version of the same arrangement. They had their autonomy in the ways that did not matter and gave it up in the ways that did. They made their own cultural and social decisions. They did not control their own borders or their own developmental trajectory. The Council reviewed their technology advancement programs. The Council approved or denied their expansion proposals. The Council set the pace. "And you accept that?" I asked. "We accepted it," Sale said, "because we did not think there was another option. And then we watched you say no to something much more absolute than what we were offered, with much less leverage than we had, and we began to think that perhaps we had not been fully honest with ourselves about what options actually existed." There it was. The thing beneath the thing. The Rin Collective was not acting out of altruism. They were watching humanity do something they had not believed was possible, and they were reconsidering their own history, their own choices, their own future, in the light of what we were doing. "What are you offering?" I asked. Sale told me. The Council fleet's tactical blind spots, specifically the dead zones in their sensor coverage that our small engagements had already begun to probe but which we had not fully mapped. The exact resonance frequencies for their primary propulsion systems, which confirmed and extended what Dr. Kaya had derived from the hull sensor data. The internal political structure of the Council vote that had authorized the enforcement action, including which member species had voted in favor, which had abstained, and which had voted against but had their votes overridden by the ALUN's procedural authority. And the names of 3 other species, currently Council members, who were watching what Earth was doing with the same quiet intensity that the Rin Collective was. "Not all of the Council is the Council," Sale said. "There are 23 species in the room. The alien sets the agenda. But the agenda is not unanimous. It has never been unanimous. It has simply never been challenged from outside in a way that gave the dissenting voices a reason to speak. And we're giving them a reason, I said. You are forcing a question that has been suppressed for a long time, Sale said. The council was built on the idea that there is one correct path of development, and that species which reach the stars must be guided along it by those who reach the stars first. What you are doing is not just resistance. It is a demonstration that the premise is wrong. That a species can be young and chaotic and imperfect and still know its own worth. The Rin have believed this privately for over a century. We have never had cause to say it publicly. And now, I asked. A pause. Longer than the ones before it. When Sale spoke again, the quality of the voice had changed slightly. Something had shifted in it, something that I think, across whatever distance and difference separated us, I recognized. Now you are saying it loudly enough that it is becoming impossible to pretend not to hear. I asked Sale what the Rin Collective wanted in return. Recognition, Sale said. Not as teachers, or mentors, or superiors. As equals. When your species reaches the stars, as I believe you will, we would like to be the first ones you visit. Not to be greeted as elders. To be greeted as peers. I said yes immediately, and I meant it completely. Not as a tactical exchange, not as a calculation. Because it was right, and because Sale was right, and because one of the things I had been most certain of since the moment this all began was that how we treated the beings who helped us would define what kind of species we became. Sale sent the data through the same signal path, fully encrypted, 40 minutes later. Dr. Kaya had the propulsion frequency analysis updated within 2 hours. George Cross and Colonel Hale had the tactical blind spot mapping integrated into our engagement plans before the next morning. But what mattered more than any of that, what I kept returning to in the hours that followed, was what else Sale had told me. 3 more species were watching. 3 council members who had voted against the enforcement action and been overridden. 3 species who had been part of an institution that ran on the premise that dissent was managed, not heard, and who were now watching a planet that had never been part of any institution refuse to be managed at all. The council fleet was still waiting for new strategic orders. The pause we had created was still holding. Dr. Kaya's propulsion array project was 70 hours from completion. And somewhere beyond the sky, the politics of a galaxy that had been settled for 4,000 years were beginning, very quietly, to shift. George Cross looked at the star map on our planning screen for a long time that evening. Then he tapped one point on it, in the direction of the Rin Collective's home system, which was 16 light-years away and which none of us would reach in our lifetimes. We made a friend, he said. We did, I said. In the middle of all this. That's when friendships mean the most, I said. When they cost something. He nodded slowly. We need to give Emre's people the time they need. And then we need to figure out how to end this in a way that doesn't just stop the fight. In a way that changes what happens next. I've been thinking about that, I said. I know, he said. Tell me. And I did. The relay station had been a commercial broadcast facility 18 months ago. Now it had enough encrypted communication hardware packed into it to manage a small war, which was approximately what it was doing. I had not slept in 61 hours when the broadcast window opened. I had tried, twice, in the 6 hours before it, lying on a folding cot in the back room with my eyes closed and my mind completely unable to stop. George Cross had eventually come in and said, "You don't have to sleep. You just have to rest your body for an hour," and I had done that, and it had been enough, barely, to get me to the terminal with clear eyes and a voice that did not shake. The window was 7 minutes and 20 seconds wide. That was how long the Rin Collective's relay access could hold the Council's all-species communication network open without triggering an automatic security audit. 7 minutes and 20 seconds to speak to 200 billion beings across 23 species before the channel closed. Sale had spent 3 days arranging it and had, by her own account, called in every favor available to the Rin Collective's diplomatic corps, stretched certain technical agreements to their absolute limit, and convinced 2 other species to contribute relay capacity in ways that were, in her words, within the letter of Council regulations and far beyond their spirit. I was going to use every second. I want to tell you what it felt like to sit in that room with the channel open and the transmission light active and the knowledge that whatever I said in the next 7 minutes would reach further than any human voice had ever reached before. I want to tell you honestly, without making it sound braver than it was. It felt like standing at the edge of something enormous and knowing the only option was to speak clearly. I did not write a speech. I had thought about writing one, had sat with a blank page for an hour the night before, and had realized that a speech was the wrong shape for what this needed to be. A speech is a performance. What this needed was a conversation. Even if it was one-sided, even if no one responded, even if the words went out into the dark and I never knew what they did when they got there. It needed to be real. I spoke in English, because it was my language, and sales team was providing simultaneous translation into every council language in real time. The translation, Sale had told me, would carry not only the words but the effect, the tone, the weight of how the words were delivered. Every species would receive it in the register that matched their own communication norms. I began. My name is Yara Osei. I am a human being, from the planet Earth, in the star system you have catalogued as Solar System J, 7734 on the outer edge of the Milky Way galaxy. We are, by your classification, a Tier 0 species. I am here to dispute that. I gave it a pause. Not for drama. Because the next part required a certain kind of honesty and I wanted to arrive at it properly. Not because the classification is based on false information. Because it is based on incomplete information. And I want to give you the rest. The transmission light was steady. The channel was open. The Galactic Council's representative cited our history as evidence of our unsuitability for self-governance. Our conflicts. Our environmental record. Our political divisions. All of it is accurate. Every part of it happened. I am not standing here to pretend otherwise. I looked at the wall across from me. There was a window on that wall, and through the window, I could see the sky. It was early morning and the sky was a pale clear blue and there were no council ships visible from this location, though I knew they were there, holding position above the Pacific, still waiting for new orders, still paused in the uncertainty that George Cross and Dan Cole and Oliver Webb and 100 other people had built around them. But here is what the record also shows, I said. We noticed. Every time we caused damage, we noticed. Every time we hurt each other, eventually, we noticed. Every time we made a choice that made the world worse, there were human beings who saw it and said this is wrong and worked to change it. Sometimes it took too long. Sometimes it failed entirely. Sometimes the cost of noticing was paid by people who deserved better. I stopped. Not because the thought was finished, but because some things need a moment of space to land properly. We are a species that is capable of great harm and also of something else. We are capable of looking at what we have done and deciding to do differently. That capacity, the capacity to change course, to look honestly at our own failures and try to correct them, that is not a sign of instability. It is the only thing that has ever actually worked, in the long run, for any kind of living system. I thought about Sale. I thought about what she had told me, that the Rin Collective had believed for over a century that development could look different from what the Council prescribed. That they had simply never had a reason to say so publicly. I was about to give them that reason. I want to speak directly to the species within the Council who have had doubts about this enforcement action, I said. I know you exist. I know that the vote that authorized this was not unanimous, that the rules of procedure made your dissent invisible. I want you to know that it was not inaudible. That Earth is aware of it and grateful for it, and that what I am saying now is also for you. The transmission timer showed 3 minutes and 49 seconds remaining. The Galactic Council was founded on a principle. That species who reach the stars have a responsibility to guide those who come after. I do not dispute that principle. I dispute the interpretation of it that says guidance means control. That says a species that has not yet left its home system must be told what it is allowed to become. I leaned forward slightly. How many of you remember what it felt like to be where we are? How many of you were told, by something older and larger, what you were and what you were not? And how many of you, in the quiet places, wished that someone had trusted you to find your own way? 4 minutes and 11 seconds had passed. We are not asking for protection. We are not asking to be managed more gently. We are asking for the recognition that we are a people, with our own history and our own understanding of our own worth, and that no council formed by beings who have never lived on our world and never carried our history has the right to tell us that our future belongs to them. On the other end of the channel, in chambers I could not see, on ships and stations and worlds that were currently receiving this signal, 200 billion beings were hearing this. I had no way of knowing how they were receiving it. What it meant to them. Whether any of it landed in a way that mattered. I only knew that I had to say it and say it honestly. I am going to ask you a question, I said, and I want you to sit with it, because it is not a simple question and it does not have a quick answer. The timer showed 1 minute and 12 seconds. Has the Galactic Council ever been wrong? Silence in the relay station. Outside, the morning sky was brightening. Somewhere above it, the fleet was waiting for orders. If the answer is yes, even once, then the question of whether it is wrong now is a legitimate one. And if that question is legitimate, then what we are asking for, the right to be heard, the right to have our objection considered rather than suppressed, is also legitimate. We are not threatening the Council. We are not claiming to be its equals in age or knowledge or technology. We are claiming the right to be part of the conversation about our own future. And we are asking every species in that council chamber to consider whether the institution they belong to is capable of being what it claims to be, a guide, rather than simply what it functions as, a constraint. 51 seconds. Earth will not surrender. Not because we are reckless or violent or unable to understand what we are facing. Because we are none of those things. We are a species that has looked honestly at its own history and decided that the thing most worth keeping, after all of it, is the right to decide our own story. 30 seconds. We would like to be part of your galaxy as ourselves. Not as something managed into a safer shape. We ask the Council to suspend its enforcement action and open a formal review. We ask the member species who voted against this action to make that vote visible. And we ask anyone who is listening, anyone in this galaxy who has ever been told what they were allowed to be and felt that it was not enough, to consider whether the rules that produce that feeling are the right rules. 15 seconds. My name is Yara Osei. This is Earth. And we are still here. The channel closed. The relay station was very quiet for about 4 seconds. Then Oliver Webb said, softly, "That's going to do something." I did not know yet whether he was right. I sat in the transmission chair and felt, all at once, every hour of the 61 I had been awake, the weight of them settling into my bones. George Cross put a hand on my shoulder briefly and said nothing, which was exactly right. Then the first response came in. Not from the Council. Not from the Alien. From Sale. 2 more species have formally filed dissenting statements with the Council's Administrative Secretariat, the message read. The Secretariat is constitutionally required to record and acknowledge them. This has not happened in 140 years. The channel was not cut. They heard everything. I read it twice. Then I looked at George Cross. Emre's project, I asked. Done, he said. 4 hours ahead of schedule. We can demonstrate capability on their propulsion systems without firing a single weapon. We can show them we can, without doing it. Sometimes the most important shot is the one you don't have to take. I nodded. And the fleet? George Cross looked at the tracking display. Still holding. New orders from the Council's Central Authority have been delayed while an emergency procedural review is convened to address the dissenting statements. A procedural review. In the middle of an enforcement action. Because of dissenting statements that were constitutionally required to be filed. Because of something Sale had arranged and a coalition of species had found the courage to do. How long does a procedural review take? I asked. George Cross almost smiled. For an institution that has not conducted one in 140 years. Nobody knows. They're going to have to find the rules. I thought about that. An institution 4,000 years old, going to find the rules it had forgotten it had, because 8 billion people on a Tier 0 planet had made it impossible to ignore those rules any longer. The enforcement order arrived 48 hours later. It was not a reversal. It was a suspension, pending the completion of the procedural review, which itself had grown to include a formal assessment of the Council's classification methodology, a requirement for member species dissenting votes to be recorded and made available to the full Council, and, in a development that even Sale had not predicted, a motion filed by 4 species requesting the creation of a new classification tier. Not Tier 1. Not Tier 0. Something that had never existed before. A classification for a species that did not fit the existing model. A species that was too fast, too unpredictable, too determined to be placed neatly in any existing category. The alien opposed the motion. They opposed everything that had happened in the previous 96 hours, loudly and precisely and with the specific kind of intensity that belongs to something that is not quite afraid but has begun to suspect it might be wrong. They did not prevail. The provisional autonomous status classification was granted by a margin of 14 species to 7, with 2 abstentions, in a council vote that was, for the first time in its recorded history, fully public. Every member species could see every vote. The alien's procedural authority had not covered that requirement because the requirement had never been invoked before. I read the decision in the relay station, sitting in the same chair where I had made the broadcast, with Oliver Webb and George Cross and the 2 communication specialists who had kept the equipment running for 93 consecutive hours without a single system failure. George Cross read it with me. When he finished, he folded his hands on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, 300 years. What? They told us we were going to be managed for 300 years, he said. And we pushed back in 4 days. I thought about all the people who had made those 4 days what they were. Dan Cole, somewhere over the ocean, checking his equipment. Dr. Emre Kaya, running calculations on frequencies he had never had reason to study until 4 days ago. Oliver Webb, steady hands, reading signal patterns nobody had told him to look for. Sale, 16 light-years away, calling in a century's worth of diplomatic patience for a species she had never met in person. The girl with the handwritten sign. The engineers in Mumbai. The people in every city who had looked at the sky and decided it was theirs. It is not finished, I said. No, George Cross agreed. Not even close. The alien will push back. They will work to reverse this through the review process. Yes. And we need to be ready for that. We need to understand the Council's internal politics well enough to defend this status in a legal and diplomatic framework, not just a military one. Yes, George Cross said again. We are not free, I said. Not the way we were before any of this started. We have obligations now, and oversight, and a galaxy full of beings forming opinions about us. No, he said. Not free the way we were. But we are something else. What? He thought about it for a moment. Known, he said finally. We are known. On our own terms. I looked at the window and the sky beyond it, and thought about Sale, and about the species that had filed dissenting statements, and about whatever ancient presence had touched our ancestors 40,000 years ago and left behind a capacity for recursive problem-solving and adaptive innovation and the specific kind of stubbornness that makes a species look at something impossible and start taking notes. When this review is over, I said, we need to go to the Rin Collective. I know, George Cross said. First visit. As equals. We promised. We did, he said. And we meant it. The sun was fully up outside the window. Somewhere above us, the Council fleet was beginning its withdrawal, moving back to a monitoring distance that was, by the terms of the suspension, required to be twice as far as their previous position. They were still there. They were not gone. This was not an ending. But the sky, for the first time since the broadcast, felt like it belonged to us again. Not because we had taken it back. Because we had stood in it and refused to leave, and the question of who had the right to be there had been forced into a forum where it could be answered honestly. My phone showed a message from Helen Ward. It was short. It said, we need to talk about what comes next. I wrote back, I know. Give me an hour. I went outside and stood on the slope of the mountainside for a few minutes, in the morning air, and looked up. The sky was clear and very blue and went on forever, the way it always had, the way it always would, and somewhere in it, 16 light-years away, a species was waiting to be visited as a peer. Somewhere further still, in directions we did not yet have names for, other species were watching what had happened and thinking about it in ways we could not predict. Some would be afraid of us. Some would be curious. Some might be the ones Sale had hinted at, the ones who had come here 40,000 years ago and left something in us that was still working. I did not know what would happen in the Council's review. I did not know what the alien's next move would be. I did not know what we would find when we eventually left this solar system and went to meet the galaxy that had tried to tell us who we were. But I knew what we would bring with us. Not weapons, though we would have those. Not treaties, though we would have those too. We would bring the thing that had gotten us through the last 4 days, the thing that the Council had studied and charted and called predictable and had been wrong about from the beginning. The capacity to look at something impossible and say no and mean it and keep meaning it until the word changed the shape of the world. George Cross came out and stood beside me. They came here expecting an ending, he said. I know. We gave them a question. Yes, I said. What do you do with a species that simply refuses to stop? George Cross looked at the sky for a long moment. Then he said, I don't think they've figured that out yet. No, I agreed. Good, he said. We stood there a little longer, two people on a mountainside, looking up at a galaxy that now knew our name. Then we went back inside, because there was work to do, and we had never been the kind of species to leave work undone. The sky stayed blue behind us. The stars stayed there, waiting. And Earth moved forward, as it always had, one decision at a time, choosing itself with every step.